What if an entire civilization could simply vanish, not with a bang, but in utter silence? Picture a society that once thrived, with its own language, traditions, and dreams, fading away so completely that it leaves behind no ruins, no written records, not even a whisper of what happened. This isn't the plot of a mystery novel. It's the haunting reality of what historians call silent collapses, entire cultures disappearing without explanation, swallowed by time itself. These aren't stories of epic battles or catastrophic eruptions that leave behind dramatic evidence. Instead, they're quiet, unsettling vanishings that challenge everything we think we know about human endurance and memory. You might wonder how something as significant as a culture could dissolve so utterly. It's a question that has puzzled archaeologists, historians, and storytellers for generations. We're about to journey into some of history's greatest enigmas, societies that flourished for centuries, only to evaporate like mist, leaving behind questions that echo across the ages. In this exploration, we'll uncover how environmental shifts, internal strife, and the slow erosion of identity can conspire to erase a people from history. We'll visit the cliff dwellings of the Anasazi, the undeciphered scripts of the Minoans, and the silent cities of the Indus Valley, searching for clues in the shadows of their absence. This isn't just a trip into the past, it's a reflection on fragility and resilience. By understanding how and why cultures fade without a trace, we begin to see the delicate threads that hold societies together, and what happens when those threads unravel. You'll come away with a deeper appreciation for the importance of cultural memory, the invisible forces that shape human history, and the quiet lessons these lost worlds offer us today. So settle in and open your mind to the mysteries of the silent collapse, where history's greatest stories are often written in silence. What sets these silent collapses apart from other historical disappearances is their almost ghost-like quality. Think about famous fallen empires like the Romans. Their dramatic decline left behind crumbling aqueducts, sprawling road networks, and volumes of written records that tell us exactly what went wrong. A silent collapse offers none of that. It's not a story written in stone or parchment. It's a story written in whispers, one that demands we listen closely to what isn't there. These aren't events marked by a single catastrophe, but rather a slow fading, like a tapestry unraveling thread by thread over generations until the entire pattern is lost. This subtlety makes them incredibly difficult for historians and archaeologists to study. Without crumbling temples or abandoned cities to point the way, researchers have to become detectives of the intangible. They sift through soil layers looking for changes in pollen that might indicate a shift in climate. They examine the chemical isotopes in ancient teeth to trace migration patterns. They compare pottery fragments and tool-making techniques across regions, searching for clues in the stylistic choices of people long gone. It's a painstaking process of connecting dots that are barely visible, relying on an interdisciplinary blend of science, anthropology, and sheer interpretive intuition. At its heart, the concept of a silent collapse forces us to confront a profound and unsettling idea: that a society's entire identity, its collective memory and way of life, can simply evaporate. This isn't just about people moving away or dying out. It's about the erasure of their essence. Their language falls silent, their rituals are forgotten, and their unique perspective on the world vanishes without an echo. It underscores a terrifying fragility inherent in all human cultures, the realization that our shared stories and traditions are not permanent. They are a flame that must be actively tended, or they can be snuffed out, leaving behind not even smoke. Now consider the profound ways in which a changing environment can act not as a sudden catastrophe, but as a slow, insidious pressure that reshapes human destiny. When the rains fail season after season, or when temperatures shift over generations, the very foundation of a society, its ability to feed itself, begins to crumble. We're not talking about a single bad harvest that people can recover from. We're talking about a persistent, grinding reality that forces impossible choices. A community that has farmed the same valley for centuries might suddenly find their ancestral knowledge useless as the climate they relied upon becomes unfamiliar. The river that once flooded predictably, nourishing their fields, might shrink to a trickle or change its course entirely, leaving behind barren silt and dust. This kind of environmental stress doesn't always leave behind a smoldering city or a layer of ash for archaeologists to find. Instead, the evidence is more subtle, etched into the landscape itself. Scientists can drill deep into ancient lake beds and ocean floors, extracting core samples that act like a historical record book. By analyzing the types of pollen preserved in each layer, they can reconstruct what plants were thriving at different points in time. A sudden shift from tree pollen to desert scrub pollen tells a story of a landscape drying out. Similarly, by examining the growth rings of ancient trees or the chemical composition of stalagmites in caves, researchers can pinpoint periods of severe drought or unusual cold that would have made survival a daily struggle. The real tragedy of such a slow-motion disaster is the social unraveling it triggers. As resources become scarce, the bonds that hold a community together are tested to their breaking point. Trade networks with neighboring groups might collapse, cutting off access to essential goods and ideas. Within the society, cooperation can fracture into competition and conflict over the dwindling supplies. The most heart-wrenching decision often becomes migration, a dispersal of families and clans in search of better land. While this ensures some survive, it also means the community shatters. The collective knowledge, the shared rituals, the oral histories that were passed down around communal fires, they fragment and fade as people integrate into new groups or struggle alone on the frontier. Their cultural identity doesn't vanish in a day. It dissolves over generations until the original language, stories, and traditions are simply forgotten, leaving no ruins behind because the people, not their buildings, were what truly defined the culture. But sometimes the greatest threat to a society doesn't come from a changing climate or an invading army, it festers from within. Imagine a culture at the peak of its power, with bustling markets and grand ceremonies, yet underneath that vibrant surface, invisible cracks are spreading through its very foundations. This is the realm of societal dynamics and internal pressures, where the collapse of a civilization can begin not with a roar, but with a whisper of discontent, a slow burning crisis of trust, or a simple failure to adapt. A society is a complex web of agreements, traditions, and shared beliefs, and when those threads begin to snap, the entire structure can unravel with a silence that echoes through the centuries. Consider the immense pressure that builds when a society's leadership loses its way. A ruling class that becomes disconnected from the people, more focused on its own privileges than on the common good, can create deep wells of resentment and political instability. Imagine a council of elders making decisions in isolation, or a dynasty of kings whose demands for tribute become unbearable. Without trust and a sense of shared purpose, the social contract, the unwritten agreement that holds a community together, starts to fracture. People begin to look out only for themselves or their immediate family, withdrawing their labor and their loyalty. This isn't a sudden revolution with barricades in the streets. It's a quiet withdrawal of consent, a gradual refusal to participate in the systems that once defined the culture. The central authority weakens, and in its place, power fragments among competing factions, each pulling in a different direction until collective action becomes impossible. Closely tied to this political decay is the slow suffocation of an economy. A society's economic system is its lifeblood, circulating resources, rewarding innovation, and supporting a division of labor that allows for art, architecture, and culture to flourish. But what happens when that system seizes up? Perhaps a reliance on a single resource, like a particular crop or a valuable mineral, leads to disaster when that resource is depleted or its value plummets. Or maybe trade routes that once brought wealth and new ideas are severed, cutting off vital goods and isolating the society from the outside world. As economic opportunities dry up, so does hope. Artisans can no longer find patrons for their work, farmers struggle under heavy taxes, and merchants go bankrupt. This economic decline isn't just about poverty. It's a corrosion of the networks of exchange and cooperation that bind a people together. When you can no longer provide for your family within the old system, your allegiance to that system and its cultural rules begins to wither. This combination of political failure and economic hardship inevitably leads to social fragmentation. The unified we of the culture splinters into a collection of isolated I's. Extended families or clans retreat into their own tight-knit circles, hoarding what little they have and distrusting their neighbors. The grand public festivals that once celebrated shared gods and ancestors are no longer organized. The skilled craftsmaster finds no one willing to apprentice, so his unique knowledge dies with him. The oral historian who memorized the tribe's genealogy and epic poems has no one to pass the stories to, because the younger generation is too busy scraping for survival to sit and listen. This is how a culture truly vanishes, not in a single cataclysm, but through 1,000 small abandonments. The shared identity, the collective memory, the very reason for being a distinct people, evaporates because there is no longer a functioning society to sustain it. The people may still be there biologically, but their culture has undergone a silent collapse, leaving behind no monuments to its failure, because the failure was not of stone and mortar, but of spirit and connection. And yet, even as internal pressures can unravel a society from within, an equally powerful force often looms just beyond its borders, one that doesn't always arrive with the clash of swords, but sometimes with the quiet, persistent pressure of a new way of life. This is the realm of external influence and cultural absorption, a process where a distinct culture doesn't so much collapse as it dissolves, like a river slowly merging into the sea, its unique identity diluted until it is indistinguishable from the surrounding waters. Unlike an environmental disaster that might force migration or internal strife that fragments a community, this form of disappearance is about being enveloped, absorbed into a larger, more dominant cultural fabric, often with such gradual subtlety that the people themselves may not have realized their own world was fading away. The mechanics of this absorption are rarely a single dramatic event. Instead, imagine a slow generational shift, a series of small, pragmatic choices that accumulate into a seismic cultural change. It might begin with trade. A neighboring, more powerful society offers desirable goods, superior metal tools, exotic textiles, or novel foods. To acquire these things, people on the periphery might start to learn a few words of the trader's language. Then perhaps a chieftain, seeking an alliance for protection against another rival, agrees to a marriage between his daughter and a son of the dominant culture's leader. This new bride brings her own customs, her own gods, and her own language into the heart of the family. Her children are raised between two worlds, but the prestige and power associated with their father's culture often make it the more attractive path. Over time, these individual choices snowball into a collective transformation. The original language, once spoken in every home and at every gathering, begins to sound old-fashioned, associated with a less prosperous past. Younger generations, eager for opportunity and social advancement, might consciously choose to speak only the new, dominant language, seeing their ancestral tongue as a barrier to success. Traditional rituals, from harvest festivals to coming-of-age ceremonies, are performed less frequently, replaced by the holidays and practices of the absorbing culture. The stories and histories once memorized by elders and passed down through song and poetry are no longer told. The knowledge of how to weave a particular pattern, craft a specific type of pottery, or interpret an ancient omen dies with the last practitioner who cared to remember. There is no moment of final defeat, no last stand. The culture simply stops being practiced and therefore stops existing. The people are still there, but their cultural identity has been seamlessly rewritten. This process leaves behind a particularly elusive kind of archaeological record. There are no burned cities or layers of destruction to mark its passing. Instead, archaeologists see a slow evolution in material culture. The distinct traditional style of pottery decoration gives way to simpler, more generic designs, or is replaced entirely by imported wares. The layout of homes might shift to mirror the architectural styles of the dominant culture. Even dietary habits change, as evidenced by animal bones and plant remains in ancient trash heaps, showing a move away from traditional foods. The challenge for historians is that this evidence is open to interpretation. Does a change in pottery style mean a new group of people moved in, or does it mean the local population adopted new customs because they were fashionable or more efficient? Without written records from the culture itself, its silent absorption into another becomes a story told only through these subtle, silent clues, a ghost of a society lingering in the changing patterns of everyday life. Now, let's turn our attention to one of the most iconic and tangible examples of this phenomenon, found not in some distant, forgotten jungle, but in the arid and breathtaking landscapes of the American Southwest. Here, the story of the people we call the Anasazi, or more respectfully, the ancestral Puebloans, unfolds like a haunting desert melody. Their legacy is etched into the very cliffs of places like Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon, where magnificent multi-story dwellings cling to sheer rock faces, silent cities of stone that whisper of a sophisticated and thriving society. These were not primitive nomads. They were master architects, astronomers who aligned their buildings with celestial events, and farmers who engineered complex irrigation systems to coax life from a dry land. They created a vibrant culture that lasted for centuries, making their sudden and complete departure from these grand homes all the more perplexing. Sometime around the end of the 13th century, something happened, something that prompted entire communities to walk away from their homes, their granaries, and their kivas, the sacred underground chambers central to their spiritual life. The evidence of this exodus is clear in the archaeological record. We can see that they simply left, but the why remains one of North America's greatest historical puzzles. There was no evidence of a massive invasion, no layer of ash from a cataclysmic fire. Instead, the abandonment appears to have been a deliberate, if hurried, process. They took their most prized possessions but left behind everyday tools, pottery, and even food stores, suggesting they intended to return, a return that never came to pass. This creates an intimate and chilling connection across the centuries. We are left looking at a place that still feels lived in, as if the residents just stepped out for a moment. Scientists have pieced together a compelling environmental narrative from the clues hidden in the region's ancient trees and soil. A severe and prolonged drought, stretching for decades, appears to have gripped the Southwest during this exact period. Tree rings from that era are exceptionally narrow, telling a story of years upon years of desperate thirst for water. For a society reliant on cultivated maize, beans, and squash, this drought would have been catastrophic. The carefully managed reservoirs and canals would have run dry, and the land, already pushed to its limits by a growing population, would have been unable to support them. The environmental stress theory is powerful, but it may not be the whole story. Some researchers point to evidence of deforestation. To build their great houses and to fuel their fires, the ancestral pueblones may have stripped the surrounding hillsides of trees, leading to soil erosion and a further degradation of their already fragile farmland. Yet, even a great drought doesn't always force a society to completely vanish. Often, it forces them to move, and indeed, many archaeologists believe that the people did not disappear, but instead migrated south and east, integrating with other Pueblo groups whose descendants live in places like Hopi, Zuni, and the Rio Grande Pueblos today. This theory of cultural absorption is supported by oral histories from these modern tribes, which tell of migrations from the north, and by similarities in language, religious practices, and artistic motifs. If this is true, then the Anasazi did not vanish in a biological sense. Their bloodlines and some of their traditions continued. However, their distinct cultural identity as the builders of Cliff Palace and Pueblo Bonito did indeed collapse. The specific knowledge of why those precise astronomical alignments were so important, the stories tied directly to those specific canyon walls, and the political structure that organized such massive construction projects, all of that may have been lost in the dispersal, a silent collapse of a unique way of life, even as the people themselves found new homes. This suggests that the true cause of their silent collapse was likely a devastating convergence of factors. The prolonged drought and resource depletion created an environmental crisis, but it may have exacerbated underlying social tensions. In times of extreme scarcity, cooperation can break down into conflict. Perhaps there was warfare between different groups competing for the few remaining fertile areas. Perhaps religious leaders lost their authority when their prayers for rain went unanswered for a generation. The social fabric, stretched taut by environmental pressure, may have finally snapped. The decision to leave their homes was probably not a single, unified event, but a series of difficult choices made by individual families and clans over many years, a gradual unraveling that ultimately led to the complete abandonment of a civilization. Their story is a profound lesson in how a culture's greatest achievements, their massive, enduring architecture, can become the very monuments to their disappearance, leaving behind stunning ruins but forever silencing the human stories that once filled them with life. While the ancestral Pueblones faced a slow environmental squeeze, the story of the Minoans offers a different kind of mystery, one that begins with a cataclysm of almost mythical proportions yet ends in a whisper. Flourishing on the island of Crete and across the Aegean Sea, the Minoans built a civilization that feels strikingly modern in its artistry and sophistication. Their sprawling palace complexes, like the labyrinthine Knossos with its vivid frescoes of leaping dolphins and graceful bull dancers, speak of a people deeply connected to the sea, confident in their power, and possessed of a vibrant cultural spirit. They were the first great civilization of Europe, a maritime trading empire whose influence stretched from Egypt to mainland Greece, and their sudden stumble from this zenith into obscurity presents a compelling case of a collapse that may have started with a bang but faded into silence. The most dramatic theory for their decline centers on one of the most violent volcanic events in human history, the colossal eruption of the Thera volcano on the modern island of Santorini around the year 1600 BC. This was not a mere rumble, It was an explosion of apocalyptic scale, estimated to be many times more powerful than the famous eruption of Krakatoa. The immediate effects would have been unimaginably horrific for the Minoans, especially those on the northern coast of Crete. A towering tsunami generated by the volcano's collapse into the sea would have slammed into their harbors and coastal settlements, obliterating their mighty fleet, the very source of their economic power, and drowning their fertile coastal plains in salt water and debris. This would have been followed by a thick blanket of volcanic ash, smothering farmland, collapsing roofs, and plunging the region into a prolonged period of dim, cold volcanic winter that would have crippled agriculture for years. Yet, while this event was undoubtedly catastrophic, it likely wasn't the sole cause of the Minoan collapse. A civilization as powerful and widespread as theirs might have been able to recover from even a disaster of this magnitude, especially if its central administration on Crete remained intact. The puzzle deepens when we look at the timeline. The archaeological record shows that the great palaces, including Knossos, were not immediately abandoned after the eruption. In fact, they were rebuilt and reoccupied for perhaps another century, though in a clearly diminished form. This suggests the initial catastrophe was a devastating blow, but not an outright knockout punch. The Minoans were staggered, but they were still on their feet, trying to reclaim their former glory. This period of fragile recovery, however, may have created the perfect conditions for a second, final blow. Weakened by the economic and agricultural havoc wrought by Thera, the Minoans would have been vulnerable, and into this power vacuum stepped a new force from the mainland, the Mycenaeans. These were a more warlike, aggressive culture, and their influence on Crete becomes increasingly apparent in the archaeological layers following the eruption. Their distinct style of pottery, weaponry, and even their script, Linear B, an adaptation of the Minoan linear, are used to write an early form of Greek begins to appear. It's possible the Mycenaeans launched a direct military invasion, conquering a weakened opponent. A more subtle theory suggests a gradual but decisive economic and cultural takeover, where Mycenaean merchants and elites slowly assumed control over the crippled Minoan trade networks and political structures. This is where the silence becomes most profound, embodied by the Minoans' own undeciphered script, Linear A. We have thousands of clay tablets inscribed with these mysterious symbols, but despite decades of effort, no one has been able to crack its code. Linear B, its descendant, was deciphered in the 1950s and revealed itself to be an administrative language, recording inventories of goods, livestock, and offerings. It tells us about the economy of the later palace period but offers no poetry, no history, no royal decrees. Because we cannot read Linear A, the Minoans have no voice. We cannot hear their own account of the eruption, their prayers to the gods for salvation, their strategies for survival, or their lament for a lost world. Their history is written entirely by the ruins they left behind and by the artifacts of those who came after them. The final act of the Minoan story, therefore, is one of absorption and erasure. Whether by conquest or slow assimilation, their unique cultural identity was ultimately subsumed by the rising Mycenaean culture. The vibrant, nature-loving art gave way to more militaristic motifs. The complex palace societies were reorganized under a new, foreign-speaking elite. Over generations, the Minoan language, religious practices, and identity faded away, leaving behind only the silent, crumbling shells of their magnificent palaces. Their collapse was not instantaneous but a prolonged fading, a quiet surrender after a catastrophic beginning. They remind us that a single disaster rarely destroys a culture outright. Instead, it weakens it, making it susceptible to the slower, quieter forces of conquest and assimilation that can ultimately erase a people's voice from history forever. While the Minoan collapse was tied to a volcanic cataclysm, the story of the Indus Valley civilization presents a mystery of an entirely different nature, one defined not by a single explosive event, but by a slow, almost imperceptible fading. Flourishing over 4,000 years ago in what is now Pakistan and northwest India, this was one of the planet's first and most extensive urban societies, a contemporary of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. Its sophistication is still staggering to contemplate. Cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were marvels of prehistoric planning, laid out in precise grid patterns with standardized brick sizes, complex water management systems featuring covered drains and public baths, and vast granaries that suggest a highly organized and centralized authority. This was a society of remarkable order and cleanliness, a Bronze Age metropolis that would not be rivaled in its urban planning for centuries to come. Yet, for all its grandeur and reach, its trade networks stretched from the Persian Gulf to central India. Its end is shrouded in a silence that is profoundly frustrating for historians. Around 1900 BC, the lights began to dim across the Indus Valley. There was no evidence of a sacked city, no mass graves suggesting a violent end, no layer of ash from a great conflagration. Instead, the archaeological record shows a pattern of gradual decline. Over generations, the meticulous order began to break down. The standardized weights and measures used for trade started to show variations. The high-quality pottery, once decorated with elegant, uniform designs like the enigmatic unicorn motif, became cruder and less elaborate. Most tellingly, people began to abandon the magnificent cities. They didn't leave in a panicked rush, they simply stopped maintaining the complex infrastructure. The great baths fell into disrepair, the drains clogged, and buildings were subdivided, suggesting a breakdown in central authority and a population that was becoming poorer, more insular, and perhaps simply giving up on the urban experiment. The absence of any obvious smoking gun has led to a fascinating detective story, with archaeologists piecing together clues from the environment itself. One of the most compelling theories points to a profound and lasting shift in the climate. Geological and archaeological evidence suggests that the mighty rivers that were the lifeblood of the civilization, particularly the Gaga-Hakra river system, often identified with the mythical Saraswati, began to change. A prolonged drought or a series of tectonic shifts that diverted their water sources would have been catastrophic. This civilization was built on agriculture, reliant on the annual floods to irrigate their fields of wheat, barley, and cotton. If those rivers slowed to a trickle or changed course entirely, the entire economic foundation would have crumbled. Crop failures would have led to famine, which would have disrupted trade and strained the social order to its breaking point. The cities, once engines of prosperity, would have become unsustainable burdens. This environmental stress likely ignited a chain reaction of internal socio-economic failures. As resources became scarce, the intricate trade networks that distributed goods across a vast area would have collapsed. This would have severed the connections between cities and their hinterlands, leaving each community to fend for itself. The ruling class, whose authority was likely based on their control of surplus food and trade, would have lost their legitimacy. Why obey the administrators in the citadel if they can no longer guarantee food or safety? Without this central organizing principle, the society would have fragmented into smaller, isolated groups. People may have chosen to simply walk away from the struggling cities, migrating eastward toward the foothills of the Himalayas or south toward the Ganges River basin, where rainfall was more reliable and life could be sustained through smaller-scale farming. The greatest barrier to truly understanding their fate, however, remains their silent voice. The Indus Valley people left behind thousands of inscriptions on seals, tablets, and pottery, written in a unique and beautifully crafted script. But despite numerous attempts, this script remains undeciphered, its language unknown. It is one of the most significant locked doors in all of archaeology. Without being able to read their words, we are forever outsiders looking in. We don't know what they called themselves, the names of their gods, their laws, or their history. We have no king lists, no epic poems of heroes, no merchant's ledger, no prayers for rain. Their entire worldview is lost to us. This ultimate silence transforms their collapse from a historical event into a profound philosophical lesson on the fragility of knowledge itself, demonstrating how easily an entire world of thought and experience can vanish from human memory, leaving behind only the silent, orderly bricks of an abandoned city. Now consider a more intimate and immediate form of collapse, one that doesn't require centuries of environmental shift, but can be triggered by a single, critical misstep in a society's relationship with its environment. This is the role of resource depletion, a process where a culture, often through its own success and expansion, inadvertently consumes the very foundation of its existence. It's a tragic paradox of progress. The more a society grows, the more it demands from the land, the water, and the forests that sustain it. Without a conscious ethic of stewardship, this relationship can turn from one of symbiosis into a kind of slow-motion consumption, where the future is sacrificed for the present until there simply is no future left. This isn't about a sudden catastrophe from the outside. It's about a quiet bankruptcy from within, a ledger of natural capital that eventually reads empty. The mechanics of this are heartbreakingly simple. Imagine a thriving agricultural community settled in a fertile river valley. For generations, their practices are sustainable. They rotate their crops, allow fields to lie fallow to recover, and draw water judiciously. But as the population grows, perhaps spurred by a period of favorable climate or successful trade, the pressure to produce more food intensifies. The community leaders, wanting to maintain stability and prosperity, push for more. Fields that were once rested are now planted season after season, draining the soil of its vital nutrients. The harvests, initially abundant, begin to dwindle. The soil becomes exhausted, thin, and less productive. To compensate, farmers might clear more land, cutting down forests that hold the soil in place and regulate the local water cycle. This deforestation leads to erosion. When the rains come, the precious topsoil is washed away into the rivers, siltation clogs the waterways, and the problem compounds itself. This declining productivity creates a domino effect that rattles the very pillars of society. As food becomes harder to grow, the economic engine of the community sputters. The surplus that once supported artisans, priests, and soldiers disappears. Trade with neighboring regions suffers, as there is less to exchange for essential goods like tools or luxury items that reinforced social status. Scarcity breeds tension. Cooperation fragments into competition, as different families or clans vie for control over the dwindling productive land and water sources. This social fragmentation is a critical step on the path to a silent collapse. The shared identity and collective purpose that define the culture erode under the daily strain of uncertainty and hunger. There's no time for maintaining grand temples or teaching the old stories. Every effort is focused on sheer survival. Ultimately, the land can no longer support the population it once nurtured. The only option left is dispersal. This isn't a coordinated migration to a promised land. It's a quiet, desperate fragmentation. Individual families or small groups pack what they can carry and leave in search of better opportunities, often merging with other societies on the periphery. This is why resource depletion so often leads to a silent collapse rather than a dramatic one. There are no great ruins left behind from a final, tragic battle over the last well. Instead, the settlement is gradually abandoned. Houses slowly crumble, irrigation canals fill with silt, and the forest begins to reclaim the fields. Within a few generations, the specific cultural practices, the unique dialect, the oral histories tied to that specific valley, they all fade away as the people assimilate into new groups. The original culture vanishes not with a bang, but with a sigh, its disappearance recorded only in the silent, archaeological evidence of a changing landscape, the pollen record showing a shift from diverse crops to weeds, or the geological layers revealing a sudden increase in erosion at the very time the site was abandoned. This pattern isn't confined to the ancient world. It echoes as a stark warning for our own global society. The story of Easter Island is perhaps the most famous parable of resource depletion, where an isolated culture's overexploitation of trees led to ecological and social catastrophe. But we see smaller, quieter versions of this story everywhere. The lessons from these silent collapses are profoundly clear. Environmental stewardship is not a luxury or a modern political idea. It is the most fundamental requirement for cultural longevity. A society that manages its resources wisely, that understands the limits of its environment and lives within them, invests in its own future. One that fails to do so is essentially consuming its own cultural capital, ensuring that its story, no matter how grand, will one day be interrupted by a final, silent page. This sobering reflection on our physical limitations naturally leads us to ponder another kind of limitation, the technological boundaries that constrained ancient societies and made their knowledge so vulnerable to being lost. Now, let's shift our focus from the physical resources a society consumes to the intellectual tools it possesses, or lacks. The technological limitations of ancient times created a profound vulnerability, a fragility in the very fabric of cultural memory that made silent collapses not just possible, but almost inevitable. For us, living in an age of cloud storage and digital archives, it's difficult to grasp a world where knowledge was not something you could preserve in a book or on a server, but something fragile and living, carried in the minds of a select few and passed along through the precarious chain of human memory. A society's entire intellectual and cultural wealth could vanish in the space of a single generation if that chain was broken. Consider the monumental task of preserving complex information without a robust writing system. Many cultures had oral traditions of immense sophistication, where trained bards or elders could recite genealogies, legal codes, epic histories, and astronomical knowledge that spanned generations. This was an incredible feat of human intellect, but this system was terrifyingly fragile. It relied on a stable society to train new rememberers, a cultural consensus on what was worth preserving, and the simple, brutal luck that a plague or a war wouldn't wipe out the entire class of knowledge keepers. If a drought forced the dispersal of a tribe, the intricate web of stories and practical knowledge could instantly unravel. The elder who knew the secret location of a hidden water source might die on the journey. The shaman who understood the medicinal properties of a specific plant might be separated from the group. The storyteller who held the creation myths that bound the people together might have no one left to teach. The knowledge wouldn't be archived in a library, it would simply cease to exist. This limitation extended beyond history and ritual into the realm of practical survival. Technological innovation, the very thing that could help a society adapt to new challenges, was also hindered. A clever innovation, a new tool design, a more efficient fishing technique, a better way to store grain might be developed in one village. But without a means to widely communicate and record this discovery, it could easily die with its inventor or remain a localized secret. There was no ancient equivalent of a patent office or a scientific journal to share breakthroughs across a civilization. This meant that societies were often trapped in a cycle of reinventing the wheel, unable to build collectively on past successes. Faced with a new environmental threat like a prolonged drought, they might lack the shared technological toolkit to engineer a solution, such as more advanced irrigation or water storage, simply because the person who had once sketched the idea in the sand wasn't there to share it when it was most needed. The choice of materials for the few records that were kept also played a crucial role. Cultures that wrote on perishable materials like bark, bamboo, palm leaves, or animal skins left behind almost nothing for archaeologists to find, especially in humid or temperate climates where organic matter decays quickly. Imagine an entire literature, a complete set of laws and poetry, written on materials that turn to dust within centuries. This creates a massive blind spot in our understanding. A society could have been immensely sophisticated in its governance and art, but if they didn't carve their stories in stone, they effectively become silent to us. Their collapse appears total and mysterious because the very evidence of their complexity has been erased by time and the elements. The stark contrast with cultures like the Egyptians, who carved hieroglyphs into impervious stone, is a powerful reminder that a civilization's longevity in the historical record can be as much about their choice of stationery as it is about their power. This paints a sobering picture of ancient innovation as a flickering candle flame in a vast, dark room. Each generation had to carefully shelter and pass along that flame, and a single gust of wind, a famine, a migration, a war could extinguish it forever, plunging not just a people but their entire way of understanding the world into permanent darkness. This profound vulnerability forces us to appreciate the incredible resilience of oral traditions, the one thread that sometimes, against all odds, managed to keep a spark of knowledge alive across the centuries. Yet for all their richness, these living libraries possessed a terrifying fragility. An oral tradition is not a book you can place on a shelf to be rediscovered centuries later. It is a performance, a relationship, a continuous act of communal remembering that requires a specific set of conditions to survive. It needs a stable society, a shared language, and most critically, an unbroken chain of teachers and students dedicated to the meticulous art of transmission. The moment that chain is snapped, an entire world of knowledge can evaporate into silence, leaving behind no physical trace for archaeologists to unearth. This isn't merely the loss of stories, it is the extinction of a unique way of seeing the universe, a collapse that happens not in the stone of buildings but in the very air between people. The process of keeping this knowledge alive was itself a monumental and delicate undertaking. In many cultures, this responsibility fell to specially trained individuals, bards, griots, elders, or shamans who underwent years of rigorous apprenticeship to memorize vast troves of information. They weren't just reciting entertaining tales, they were the living repositories of their people's lore, history, genealogy, and spiritual beliefs. A single epic poem could function as a moral guide, a historical record, and a map of ancestral territories all at once. The survival of this knowledge depended on a society healthy and cohesive enough to support these specialists, to gather and listen, and to value the old ways enough to ensure a new generation was always ready to learn. It was a system that worked beautifully in times of stability, but it had no backup, no fail-safe. The knowledge existed only as long as the people who held it in their minds. This explains why events that cause social fragmentation are so catastrophic for oral cultures. A prolonged famine, a devastating epidemic, or a forced migration doesn't just kill people, it kills knowledge. If a community is scattered, the elder who holds the key to a sacred ritual may die alone, taking that ritual with them. The family lineage responsible for remembering a crucial peace treaty with a neighboring tribe might be wiped out by disease, erasing the memory of that alliance and potentially sowing the seeds for future conflict. The dispersal of the ancestral pueblones, for instance, likely led to the fragmentation of their complex oral histories. While their descendants in modern Pueblo communities retain profound cultural knowledge, the specific stories, ceremonies, and reasons tied directly to the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde may have been altered, condensed, or lost entirely during that difficult period of migration and integration into new groups. Even when oral histories survive, they present a unique challenge to historians. Without a written text to provide a fixed version, these stories are inherently fluid, evolving with each telling to remain relevant to the current audience. A story about a great flood from 1,000 years ago might absorb elements from a more recent flood, its details shifting to emphasize a new moral lesson or to reflect a changed environment. This doesn't make the history less valuable. It makes it a different kind of truth, one that tells us as much about the people remembering as it does about the events being remembered. Ethnographers working with indigenous communities today sometimes uncover tantalizing fragments of ancient events, oral accounts of sea level rise that correlate with the end of the last ice age, or stories of volcanic eruptions that match geological records. But these are often pieces of a much larger puzzle, the surviving chapters of a book whose table of contents has been lost forever. This profound fragility forces us to expand our definition of cultural collapse. It's not always about the abandonment of cities. Sometimes it's about the abandonment of memory. A people can physically survive, their biological lineage continuing, while their unique cultural identity, the specific combination of stories, songs, and beliefs that made them who they were, fades into the background noise of a dominant culture, diluted beyond recognition. This silent erosion of self is perhaps the most complete form of disappearance because it leaves nothing to excavate, no ruins to point to and say, "A great people once lived here." All that remains is a silence where there once was song, an empty space where a world of meaning once thrived, reminding us that the most enduring monuments a culture builds are not made of stone but of story. This slow unraveling of a society's soul, the erosion of cultural memory and identity, represents perhaps the most profound and heartbreaking form of silent collapse. Unlike a city abandoned to the elements, where stone walls and pottery shards remain to mark a people's presence, this is a vanishing that happens in the intangible realm of thought and belief. It is the gradual, often imperceptible, fading of a shared world view, the collective understanding of where a people came from, why they are here, and how they should live. When this framework dissolves, a culture ceases to exist not because its people have perished, but because the invisible bonds that made them a distinct community have been severed, leaving no ruins behind because the most important structures were built not of brick and mortar, but of story and song. This process of erosion is rarely a sudden event. It is more like a cultural tide going out, slowly and inevitably. It often begins with the most vulnerable elements of a culture, the aspects that require constant practice and reinforcement to survive. A language, for instance, is not just a set of words but an entire universe of concepts, jokes, and ways of seeing that are unique to its speakers. When children are no longer taught the old tongue, perhaps because a dominant language offers more economic opportunity or because it is actively suppressed, an entire dimension of cultural understanding vanishes with it. The specific words used to describe a particular type of snow, a nuanced emotion, or a sacred concept are simply lost, and with them, the subtle wisdom they contained. Similarly, rituals and ceremonies that mark the passage of the seasons, birth, marriage, and death, can slowly atrophy. If a community stops gathering for the annual harvest festival because everyone is too busy or because it's no longer deemed important, the shared experience that reinforced their connection to the land and to each other disappears. The knowledge of how to perform the songs, the dances, the specific prayers, it fades from memory one skipped generation at a time. This loss is frequently accelerated by the powerful forces of assimilation. When a smaller, less powerful culture comes into sustained contact with a larger, more dominant one, the pressure to conform can be immense. This isn't always a violent or forced process. It can be a series of quiet, pragmatic choices made by individuals seeking a better life for their families. Parents might choose to speak only the dominant language at home so their children will succeed in school. They might adopt new styles of dress, new foods, and new forms of entertainment, gradually letting go of the old ways. Over generations, the original culture becomes a distant memory, a set of vague traditions mentioned by grandparents but not lived by the youth. The original identity is suppressed not by malice, but by the quiet, relentless pressure of practicality and the desire for social acceptance. The culture doesn't die, it dilutes, its unique colors washing out until it becomes indistinguishable from the background. The result is a historical silence that is incredibly difficult for archaeologists and historians to penetrate. How do you excavate a forgotten language? How do you find artifacts for a suppressed ritual? A society that undergoes this kind of cultural erosion may leave behind physical evidence of its existence: pottery, tools, the foundations of houses, but the meaning behind those objects is gone forever. We might unearth a beautifully carved ceremonial mask, but without the oral traditions that explained its use, the stories of the spirit it represented, or the songs that were sung when it was worn, it is just an object. Its soul has been erased. This helps explain the ultimate mystery of silent collapses, why some societies seem to vanish without a physical trace. In many cases, they didn't. Their people likely survived, migrated, and integrated. What vanished was their unique cultural identity, the intricate and beautiful pattern of beliefs and practices that made them who they were. Their disappearance was not physical but existential, a quiet fading of the light that once defined their world, leaving us to ponder the empty space where a culture used to be. This scattering of people, this great human diaspora driven by necessity or hope, is one of the most powerful and yet least visible engines of silent collapse. Unlike a city destroyed by war, where the evidence of conflict is etched into broken walls and spent arrowheads, a migration often leaves behind a landscape that appears simply quiet. The houses stand empty, the fields go fallow, and the only thing that has truly vanished is the people themselves. It's a disappearance not of stone and mortar, but of spirit and sound, as the collective hum of a community is replaced by the whisper of the wind. Consider the immense pressure that forces an entire culture to make the heart-wrenching decision to leave everything they know behind. Often, it begins with a slow, environmental squeeze, a prolonged drought that turns fertile plains to dust, a creeping shift in climate patterns that makes ancient farming knowledge obsolete, or the gradual depletion of a critical resource like fresh water or game. These are not sudden catastrophes but slow-burning crises that give people time to make a choice, stay and face almost certain decline, or gather their families and belongings to seek a new beginning in an unknown land. This decision is rarely made by an entire population at once. It might start with a few adventurous families, those willing to gamble on the rumors of greener pastures. Their successful settlement paves the way for others, starting a trickle that can become a flood, draining the homeland of its most vital resource, its people. The journey itself acts as a crucible, forcing rapid and often painful adaptation. As they travel, migrant groups encounter new environments, new neighbors, and new ways of life. To survive, they must be pragmatic. They might adopt new hunting techniques, learn to build shelters from different materials, or begin to trade with the peoples they meet along the way. With each adaptation, a little piece of their original cultural identity is set aside, not out of disrespect but out of necessity. A specific ritual tied to a mountain they left behind loses its relevance. A song about a river that no longer flows holds less meaning for children born on the trail. The culture begins to bend to become more fluid, its hard edges softened by the constant motion and the need to get along. The final stage, integration into a new society, is often where the original culture completes its silent dissolution. When a smaller, migrating group arrives in the territory of a larger, established culture, the pressure to assimilate can be overwhelming. For the sake of their children's future, parents might choose to speak the dominant language at home. They might adopt local styles of dress to avoid standing out, or participate in new religious festivals to build community ties. Intermarriage between the groups creates families with blended traditions, where the old ways become stories told by grandparents, cherished but not lived. Over a few generations, the distinct language, customs, and identity of the migrating group fade, absorbed into the cultural fabric of their new home. There is no moment of defeat, no official surrender. The culture simply stops being practiced, and in doing so, it ceases to exist. This process is especially elusive for archaeologists to trace. A peaceful migration doesn't leave layers of destruction. Instead, the evidence is subtle and open to interpretation. Researchers might find a gradual change in pottery styles at a site, suggesting the introduction of new techniques from elsewhere. Or they might see a shift in dietary remains as people start eating new types of grains or meats, but proving that this represents a migrating group rather than simply trade or cultural influence is incredibly difficult. The story of nomadic peoples is even more challenging to piece together. Their entire existence was based on movement, leaving behind temporary campsites with few permanent structures. Their cultural monuments were not pyramids or palaces, but stories, songs, and kinship ties, all of which evaporated when the groups dispersed or settled down. Their silent collapse is the ultimate testament to the idea that a culture is not a place, but a people, and when the people scatter, the culture can vanish into thin air. While the silent collapses of ancient cultures like the Anasazi and the Indus Valley feel distant, shrouded in the mists of millennia, history has a way of repeating its most haunting patterns much closer to our own time. In the late 16th century, a bold and ambitious venture known as the Roanoke colony was established on the shores of what is now North Carolina, representing one of the first English attempts to plant a permanent settlement in the New World. Its story, however, would not be one of triumph and expansion, but would instead become the most famous cold case in American history, a silent collapse that unfolded not in deep antiquity, but on the very cusp of the modern era of record-keeping. The basic facts are straightforward yet utterly baffling. In 1587, a group of approximately 115 English men, women, and children, led by Governor John White, were left to establish the colony. Soon after their arrival, White was forced to sail back to England to secure more supplies and support. His return was delayed for 3 long years by the outbreak of war with Spain. When he finally made it back to Roanoke Island in 1590, he found the settlement utterly deserted. The houses had been carefully dismantled, not destroyed, suggesting a planned departure rather than a panicked flight. There were no signs of a struggle, no mass graves, and no cross markings, a prearranged signal for distress. The only clue left behind was a single word carved into a fort post, Croatone, and the letters Crow carved into a nearby tree. This solitary word has fueled centuries of speculation, debate, and wild theories. Croatone was the name of a nearby island, modern-day Hatteras Island, which was also the home of a Native American tribe of the same name who had been generally friendly to the English. The most plausible theory, supported by later ethnographic research and oral histories, is that the colonists, facing extreme hardship and starvation, split into smaller groups and were absorbed into local indigenous communities. They would have sought survival through integration, learning new ways of life and marrying into the tribes. Over a generation or two, their distinct English identity would have faded through assimilation, their language and customs slowly replaced by those of their new families. This would be a classic silent collapse, not of a vast civilization, but of a small, vulnerable community dissolving into a larger cultural landscape. Yet other theories persist, highlighting how the thinnest sliver of doubt can sustain a mystery forever. Perhaps the colonists tried to sail back to England on their own and were lost at sea in a storm. Maybe they were attacked by a hostile tribe or by the Spanish who were operating to the south. Disease could have ravaged the population, leaving too few survivors to maintain the settlement. The terrifying power of the Roanoke story lies in this very lack of closure. Despite occurring in an age of expanding European exploration and documentation, the event was so poorly recorded and so quickly overshadowed by later, successful colonies that it slipped into the realm of legend. It stands as a stark reminder that incomplete documentation can create a historical silence just as profound as the passing of thousands of years. The Roanoke mystery perfectly bridges the gap between the ancient world and our own, demonstrating that the forces driving silent collapses, environmental stress, the need to migrate, and the powerful pull of cultural absorption did not cease with the advent of written history. They simply occurred in a context where we expected better records, making their silence all the more deafening. This small, failed colony on the edge of the Atlantic serves as a poignant prelude to a far more widespread and devastating agent of disappearance, one that would repeatedly scourge the Americas in the centuries that followed: the invisible, silent, and utterly ruthless spread of epidemic disease. But the story of Roanoke, for all its mystery, was merely a prelude to a far more widespread and devastating form of silent collapse that would sweep across the continents. This force was invisible, silent, and utterly ruthless, leaving behind not abandoned forts, but empty villages and a profound, echoing silence where entire cultures once thrived. We are talking about the role of disease and demographic collapse, a biological catastrophe that could erase a society not by destroying its buildings, but by annihilating the very people who gave those buildings meaning, severing the chain of cultural transmission in a single, horrifying generation. Imagine a scenario far more devastating than any drought or famine. A new pathogen, introduced from the outside world, arrives in a population that has no prior exposure, and therefore no natural immunity. Diseases like smallpox, measles, or influenza, which were commonplace and often survivable in Europe, became apocalyptic events in the Americas and other isolated regions. The death toll wasn't just high, it was catastrophic, often wiping out 90% or more of a community in a matter of weeks. This isn't just a tragedy of individual lives lost, it is a catastrophe of collective memory. When such a staggering percentage of a population dies, the society's intricate knowledge system simply shatters. The elders who held the sacred stories, the artisans who knew the unique crafting techniques, the healers who understood the medicinal properties of local plants, the parents who were teaching the language to their children, nearly all of them are gone. In one swift, brutal blow, the culture's living library is burned to the ground. The archaeological evidence for this kind of event is uniquely haunting. There are no signs of invasion, no new styles of weapons or evidence of burning. Instead, researchers might find mass burial sites, a silent testament to a community overwhelmed by death, unable to carry out their traditional funerary practices. Or they might find nothing at all, a village site that shows signs of normal life, then simply stops. The most telling clue is often the sheer absence of evidence following a certain date. Pottery styles cease to evolve, new construction halts, the layers of occupation just end, replaced by layers of natural soil and decay. It is a silence written directly into the earth itself. For the handful of survivors, the world has literally ended, facing unimaginable grief and the complete breakdown of their social order. Their only option for survival is often to abandon their homeland and join another group. This dispersal and assimilation is the final nail in the coffin of their original culture. A small band of survivors, adopting the language and customs of a new community to survive, cannot possibly preserve the full complexity of their former way of life. Within a generation or two, their unique identity is subsumed. This is why disease is such a potent agent of silent collapse. It doesn't just kill people, it kills culture itself by making its continuation impossible. The people may live on in the genetic code of their descendants, but their distinct traditions, language, and worldview vanish forever, leaving no ruins behind because the greatest loss was human. Now, let's consider the intricate web of trade and economy that often forms the lifeblood of a civilization, a network so vital that its unraveling can lead to a silence as profound as any plague or drought. A society's economic system is far more than just a way to distribute goods. It is the circulatory system that connects distant communities, supports a division of labor, and creates the surplus wealth necessary for art, architecture, and culture to flourish. When this system fails, the entire body of the civilization can go into shock, not with a dramatic crash, but with a slow, quiet fading as the connections that bind it together simply wither away. Imagine a thriving ancient city, not as an isolated fortress, but as a vital node in a vast, interconnected network. Its artisans might depend on tin from 1,000 miles away to alloy with local copper and produce bronze. Its elite might derive their status from controlling the flow of exotic goods like spices, ivory, or rare textiles. Its farmers might trade surplus grain for tools and pottery they cannot make themselves. This complex interdependence creates resilience and prosperity, but it also creates profound vulnerability. The entire cultural edifice, the ability to support scribes to keep records, priests to maintain temples, and soldiers to provide defense rests upon the steady hum of this economic engine. If that hum falls silent, the entire society can destabilize. The collapse of these trade networks can be triggered by any number of events far beyond a single community's control. A shift in climate could make a once passable mountain route too dangerous for caravan traffic for decades. The rise of a new, aggressive power could block a crucial river or sea lane, severing the artery of commerce. The economic failure or conquest of a key trading partner could destroy the demand for a city's primary export. When these links are broken, the consequences ripple through the society. The artisan can no longer get the materials he needs, so his workshop closes. The merchant goes bankrupt, and the taxes he paid to the central authority vanish. The ruling class, which derived its power and legitimacy from controlling this wealth, suddenly finds its coffers empty and its authority questioned. This economic decline forces a painful series of adaptations that often lead directly to cultural fragmentation. As centralized control weakens, people revert to a more local, subsistence-level existence. The grand projects that define the culture, the building of temples, the patronage of artists, the maintenance of infrastructure, are abandoned. Communities that were once tightly integrated into a regional economy become isolated and insular, forced to rely only on what they can produce themselves. This isolation is a breeding ground for the erosion of shared identity. Without the constant interaction and exchange that trade provides, local dialects begin to diverge more sharply. Localized variations in religious practice emerge. The shared cultural markers that once defined the civilization as a unified whole, a specific style of pottery, a common set of artistic motifs begin to disappear, replaced by cruder, more utilitarian local versions. The silent collapse occurs when this fragmentation becomes complete. A people who once identified as part of a great trading empire may, over several generations of isolation, come to see themselves only as members of their small village or valley. The knowledge of their former connections, the stories of distant lands and trading partners, fade into myth and are eventually forgotten. When archaeologists later uncover their sites, they might see a sudden decline in the quality and variety of goods. The presence of exotic materials in the soil layers simply stops. The evidence points to a people who turned inward and downward, their horizons shrinking until their world became only as large as they could walk in a day. Their culture didn't vanish in a single event. It simplified, localized, and ultimately forgot its own grander history, leaving behind no written explanation because the economic collapse that triggered it also ended the practice of keeping such records. Yet, even as environmental pressures and economic networks test a society, the very heart of its decision-making structure, its leadership and governance, can become the source of its most profound and silent undoing. A culture's institutions, its rules for distributing power and resources, are the framework that holds everything else together. When that framework rots from within due to incompetence, corruption, or sheer rigidity, the entire society can begin to crumble not with a dramatic revolution, but with a quiet, collective sigh of resignation as trust evaporates and collective purpose dissolves into individual survival. The most dangerous failure of leadership is often a loss of legitimacy, the moment when the people no longer believe their rulers are acting in the common good. Imagine a ruling class that becomes increasingly isolated in its palace or citadel, more concerned with lavish displays of wealth and power than with ensuring the canals are dredged or the granaries are full. Perhaps they hoard resources during a drought, or impose crippling taxes to fund grandiose monuments while the farmers struggle to feed their families. This isn't just an economic problem, it's a crisis of faith. The unwritten social contract, the agreement that the people will follow the rules in exchange for order and prosperity, begins to tear. When leaders are seen as corrupt or self-serving, the moral authority that holds a complex society together simply vanishes. People start to obey out of fear rather than respect, and fear is a fragile glue that cracks under pressure. This erosion of trust makes a society catastrophically fragile in the face of external challenges. A strong, adaptive government can mobilize a population to build new irrigation systems in response to a drought, organize trade missions to secure scarce resources, or reinforce defenses against a threat. A weak or illegitimate government, however, is paralyzed. Factions within the elite might squabble over the dwindling spoils of power instead of acting decisively. Inefficient and corrupt bureaucracies fail to distribute aid where it's needed most. The central authority's commands are ignored by regional governors or local chieftains who see the writing on the wall and begin to look out for themselves. This fragmentation of power creates a vacuum where collective action becomes impossible, and the society simply cannot muster a coordinated response to the threats it faces. It's not that the solutions aren't there, it's that the political will and organizational structure to implement them have collapsed from within. The historical record is tragically full of whispers of this process. While we rarely find a tablet that says the king was incompetent, we see the consequences etched into the archaeological record. We might see evidence that a once uniform system of weights and measures, a key tool for fair trade and taxation, becomes irregular, suggesting central control is breaking down. The careful maintenance of public infrastructure like roads and water systems ceases. The quality of public works declines, as if the skilled artisans are no longer being paid or directed. Perhaps most tellingly, we see people leaving the administrative centers and moving to the countryside, a quiet vote of no confidence in the leadership. They are not fleeing an invader, they are abandoning a system that has failed them. The culture doesn't end in a fiery conquest. It disintegrates through 1,000 small desertions, as people simply withdraw their participation from a project they no longer believe in. This silent unraveling of governance underscores a crucial point. A society's greatest threat can sometimes be itself. The most sophisticated irrigation system is useless if the leaders tasked with maintaining it are diverting the resources. The most resilient trade network will fail if the merchants cannot trust the rulers to provide security or adjudicate disputes fairly. The collapse is silent because the failure is one of administration and trust, leaving behind no ruined palaces sacked by enemies, but instead quietly abandoned offices and decaying infrastructure that speak to a profound internal loss of nerve and direction. While the stability of a society can be shaken by failing economies or weak leadership, perhaps the most profound transformation occurs within the realm of belief itself. The spiritual and religious framework of a culture is the very bedrock of its identity, providing answers to life's biggest questions, dictating moral codes, and weaving a shared story that connects the community to its ancestors and the cosmos. When this foundational belief system undergoes a radical shift, it can trigger a silent collapse that is almost impossible to detect in the archaeological record, because the most significant changes happen not in the physical world, but in the human heart and mind. This process of religious transformation is rarely a simple swap of one set of gods for another. More often, it is a slow, generational erosion of faith in the old ways, frequently catalyzed by contact with a new, more powerful or appealing system of belief. Imagine a traditional society that has long worshipped nature spirits, believing that specific rituals performed by a shaman are essential to ensure the rains come and the crops grow. Then a new religion arrives, perhaps brought by traders, conquerors, or missionaries. This new faith might offer a more universal message of salvation, a more structured hierarchy, or simply be associated with the undeniable power and technological advancement of the people who practice it. The allure can be irresistible, especially for younger generations seeking new opportunities or a different kind of meaning. The old rituals begin to seem provincial, even primitive in comparison. The shaman, once a revered figure, loses his audience and his apprentices. The songs and prayers that were once sung at every harvest festival are performed less frequently, then only by the eldest members of the community, until they are finally not performed at all. The consequences for cultural preservation are devastating. In many ancient societies, the primary motivation for creating lasting records was intrinsically tied to religion. The Egyptians built pyramids and inscribed hieroglyphs to ensure a pharaoh's safe passage to the afterlife. The Maya erected stelae to record the deeds of their kings and the complex cycles of their calendar, which was itself a sacred map of time. If a new religion does not place the same emphasis on grand material monuments or detailed written records, the very impulse to create them vanishes. A faith focused on personal piety or an abstract, universal God might not require the construction of vast temples or the carving of royal genealogies into stone. When the old gods are abandoned, the projects dedicated to honoring them are abandoned too. The knowledge of how to interpret the old symbols, the stories behind the rituals, and the very reason for the society's most impressive achievements can be lost within a few generations, not through destruction, but through simple disinterest. This creates a unique challenge for historians. How do you trace the disappearance of a belief? The evidence is not in what is built, but in what stops being built. An archaeologist might find that the production of a certain type of ceremonial pottery, decorated with symbols of a traditional god, abruptly ceases. The layout of a city might change, with new types of structures like churches or mosques appearing while the old temples fall into disuse and are quarried for their stone. The most telling clue is often a shift in burial practices. The way a culture treats its dead is deeply symbolic of its beliefs about the afterlife. A change from cremation to inhumation, or from burying grave goods with the deceased to a practice with no offerings, signals a fundamental shift in worldview. These are subtle, silent changes in the archaeological record that speak volumes about a spiritual revolution that erased the old cultural identity as thoroughly as any invasion, leaving behind a people who may have looked the same but whose inner world had been completely remade. So how do we begin to hear these stories told in silence? How do we piece together the fate of a people who left no written records and whose grandest monuments were made of traditions that evaporated long ago? The answer lies not in the search for a single dramatic clue, but in the meticulous, interdisciplinary work of modern archaeology, which has developed an entire toolkit of innovative methods designed to listen to the faintest whispers of the past. This is the science of reading the landscape itself, of decoding the subtle environmental and chemical signatures that reveal the hidden chapters of human history. One of the most powerful techniques in this new arsenal is palynology, or pollen analysis. It operates on a simple but profound principle. Pollen grains are incredibly durable, and each plant species produces a uniquely shaped grain. By extracting long core samples from the bottom of ancient lakes or bogs, scientists can effectively read a layered history book of the local vegetation. A sudden, dramatic shift in the pollen record, from a diverse mix of trees and food crops to a preponderance of hardy weeds and desert scrub, paints a vivid picture of environmental distress. This is how we can confirm a decades-long drought that might have forced the ancestral Puebloans to abandon their cliff dwellings. The very dust that choked their fields is still there, trapped in the mud, telling a story of a world turning arid and inhospitable. Beyond what was growing, archaeologists can now investigate what people were eating and where they might have traveled through the science of isotope analysis. The saying, "you are what you eat," is literally true on a chemical level. Elements like strontium, oxygen, and carbon have different isotopic signatures that vary based on the local geology and climate. By analyzing these isotopes in ancient human teeth and bones, researchers can determine if an individual was native to the area where they were buried or had migrated from a distant region. A population's remains showing a wide variety of isotopic signatures might indicate a cosmopolitan trading center, while a sudden homogenization could suggest that trade routes had collapsed and the society had become isolated. This method transforms a skeleton from a mere physical specimen into a biography, revealing a lifetime of movement and diet, offering clues to large-scale migrations that left no written itineraries. Perhaps the most revolutionary advancement has been in the realm of remote sensing, which allows archaeologists to literally see beneath the ground without ever lifting a trowel. Technologies like LiDAR light detection and ranging-use laser pulses shot from an aircraft to map the ground surface with astonishing precision, digitally stripping away dense forest canopy to reveal the ghostly impressions of roads, fields, and settlements hidden for centuries. This technology has been revolutionary in places like Mesoamerica and Southeast Asia, uncovering vast, low-density urban sprawls that completely rewrite our understanding of how complex those societies truly were. Ground-penetrating radar can map buried foundations and hearths, revealing the complete layout of a village that now lies entirely beneath the surface, its story waiting to be told by the faint disturbances in the soil. The true power of these methods is not in their individual results, but in their synthesis. A pollen core showing a drought, combined with isotope evidence of sudden malnutrition in skeletons, and LiDAR data showing the abandonment of outlying farmsteads, creates a multi-layered, corroborated narrative. It allows scientists to move beyond speculation and build a data-driven story of collapse. They can see not just that a society fell, but often how it fell, a slow retreat from the margins, a period of hunger and stress, and a final, painful decision to leave. This scientific approach transforms these silent collapses from mere mysteries into understandable human tragedies, allowing us to finally hear the echoes of choices made under desperate pressure, written not on parchment, but in the very earth and bone of the past. The quiet work of decoding these silent collapses is never truly finished, as every season of fieldwork and every technological breakthrough has the potential to rewrite the narratives we thought we understood. Recent discoveries are constantly refining our picture, pulling back the curtain on historical mysteries we once believed were solved. Take the case of the Greenland Norse, a community of medieval Vikings who established thriving settlements on the edge of the Arctic. For centuries, their disappearance was a classic tale of a people who simply faded away, with traditional theories pointing fingers at a single villain, like a sudden onset of the Little Ice Age that made farming impossible. But new, multidisciplinary research paints a far more nuanced and human picture of a slow-motion cultural unraveling. By analyzing chemical isotopes in the bones of both the Norse settlers and the animal remains from their trash heaps, scientists have uncovered a story of astonishing cultural rigidity. As the climate gradually cooled, making it harder to grow European crops and raise cattle, the Norse didn't adapt by learning from the neighboring Inuit, who were master hunters of seal and walrus. Instead, the bone evidence shows they stubbornly clung to their Scandinavian identity, continuing to rely on their dwindling herds even as they suffered from malnutrition. Their silent collapse wasn't just about a changing climate, it was about a fatal inability to change their own cultural practices, leading to a gradual starvation and dispersal that left empty stone houses standing silent on the fjords. This kind of insight is only possible because of the incredible tools now at our disposal, allowing us to read the past in ways that would have seemed like magic just a few decades ago. The humble sediment core, a long cylinder of mud extracted from the bottom of an ancient lake or ocean floor, has become a time machine. Within its layers, scientists can find a detailed diary of environmental change. Shifts in the types of pollen preserved can tell us when a forest gave way to desert. Microscopic organisms called foraminifera hold secrets about past ocean temperatures. And traces of volcanic ash can pinpoint the exact year of a cataclysmic eruption, allowing us to synchronize events across the globe with stunning accuracy. This data moves us beyond vague notions of a drought and allows us to say with growing confidence that a specific 50-year period of extreme aridity correlates perfectly with the abandonment of a city halfway around the world. Similarly, genetic studies are revolutionizing our understanding of population movement. By extracting ancient DNA from skeletal remains, researchers can trace migrations and interactions that left no written record. We can now see the genetic signature of a people moving across a continent, or evidence of intermarriage and assimilation between groups that were previously thought to have been mortal enemies. forcing us to abandon simplistic invasion theories for more complex stories of cultural exchange and absorption. These new findings consistently challenge our earlier assumptions, revealing that the story of human history is rarely a simple one of cause and effect. The fall of a civilization is almost never due to a single catastrophic event, but rather a perfect storm of interconnected pressures. A prolonged drought might weaken a society, but it is the ensuing economic collapse, political instability, and social fragmentation that ultimately deliver the final blow. What makes this current era of research so exciting is its collaborative spirit. Archaeologists are no longer working alone. They are partnering with climatologists, geneticists, chemists, and even experts in satellite imagery to build a holistic understanding of the past. This multidisciplinary approach is turning the silent collapse from an impenetrable mystery into a solvable puzzle, piece by tiny piece. Each new discovery is a reminder that the past is not a static thing but a dynamic story that is constantly being revised and refined, bringing us closer than ever to hearing the whispers of those who vanished without a trace. But as we piece together these puzzles of the past using ever more powerful scientific tools, we must pause and ask a profoundly human question. Just because we can investigate a vanished culture, does that always mean we should? The quest to decode silent collapses is not conducted in a moral vacuum. It is fraught with ethical considerations that force us to look up from our microscopes and sediment cores and consider the living descendants and the sacred memory of those who are gone. This is where the cold, objective pursuit of data must meet the warm, complex reality of respect, reminding us that these are not abstract historical problems we're solving, but the stories of real people whose legacy deserves to be handled with care and integrity. One of the most immediate and sensitive ethical dilemmas revolves around the treatment of human remains. For centuries, the bones of ancient people were often treated as mere scientific specimens, excavated, catalogued, stored in museum boxes, and put on display with little thought for the cultural or spiritual beliefs of their descendants. Today, there is a growing understanding that these are not objects, but the mortal remains of individuals who may have living cultural kin. The issue becomes particularly acute when studying silent collapses, as the very lack of written records can make it difficult to definitively link ancient remains to modern indigenous groups. This has led to important movements like NAGPRA in the United States, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which provides a process for museums and federal agencies to return certain Native American cultural items, including human remains, to lineal descendants and culturally affiliated tribes. The ethical approach now prioritizes consultation and collaboration from the very beginning of any project, ensuring that research is conducted in a way that honors the wishes and beliefs of descendant communities, even if that means certain analyses are not performed. Beyond the physical remains, there is the equally important issue of narrative control and representation. For too long, the stories of vanished cultures were told exclusively by outsiders, archaeologists, and historians who often imposed their own interpretations, biases, and frameworks onto the past. A classic example is the persistent use of the term Anasazi, a Navajo word often translated as ancient enemies, to describe the ancestral Pueblones. Many modern Pueblo people find this term offensive and prefer their own terminology, which speaks to their deep cultural connection to these ancestors. Ethical research now demands that we listen to these voices. It means collaborating with indigenous scholars and community members, incorporating their oral histories not as quaint folklore to be verified by science, but as valid and crucial forms of knowledge in their own right. It means being careful not to create sensationalized or simplistic narratives of collapse that frame these cultures as failures, but instead acknowledging their resilience, complexity, and the often traumatic circumstances that led to their dissolution. This collaborative model transforms archaeology from an extractive practice where knowledge is taken from a site into a reciprocal partnership where research benefits both the academic community and the living descendants. It can involve training community members in archaeological techniques, sharing results in accessible and respectful ways, and sometimes even agreeing not to publish or disclose the location of sensitive sacred sites to protect them from looting or desecration. This shift recognizes that the ultimate authority over a culture's history should rest, at least in part, with its people. It acknowledges that the scientific desire for knowledge must be balanced against the right of communities to protect their heritage and control how their ancestors are portrayed to the world. This ethical framework ensures that our fascination with the past does not come at the expense of the people who are its living inheritors, forging a path where the mysteries of silent collapses can be explored with both rigor and profound respect. What becomes truly fascinating when we step back from individual stories of collapse is the emergence of universal patterns, a kind of haunting harmony in human history played out in different keys across the globe. By placing narratives side by side like the fate of the Rapa Nui on their remote Pacific island and the sprawling Khmer Empire in the jungles of Southeast Asia, we start to see that the script for a silent collapse often contains the same fundamental plot points, regardless of the setting or the century. This comparative analysis reveals that while the specific details are unique, the underlying vulnerabilities are a shared part of the human condition, a sobering lesson in the universal challenges of sustaining a complex society. Consider Easter Island or Rapa Nui, a place that has become a global parable for ecological overshoot. Its story is one of extreme isolation and the terrifying consequences of resource depletion on a finite island. The prevailing narrative tells of a people who, in a display of increasing cultural one-upmanship, cut down every last palm tree to erect their famous moai statues, using the logs as rollers to transport them. Without trees, the soil eroded, canoe building became impossible, cutting off access to deep water fish, and society descended into famine and warfare. The collapse appears stark and absolute, a cautionary tale of a culture that literally deforested itself into oblivion. The silence that followed was the silence of a broken ecosystem and a shattered social order, where the very statues built to honor ancestors stood witness to a world that had ended. Now shift continents and centuries to the Khmer Empire, centered at Angkor in modern-day Cambodia. This was not a small island society but a vast, sophisticated hydraulic empire that mastered water on a grand scale. Its complex network of canals, reservoirs, and barrages, massive water tanks, was an engineering marvel designed to capture monsoon rains and irrigate rice paddies, supporting a huge population and enabling the construction of breathtaking temples like Angkor Wat. Their collapse, which unfolded over a longer period in the 14th and 15th centuries, was not as simple as running out of trees. Instead, it appears to have been a multifaceted failure of their most brilliant adaptation. Evidence suggests that a period of intense monsoon variability and extended droughts, possibly linked to a sustained El Niño pattern, overwhelmed their intricate water management system. The very canals that gave them life may have exacerbated erosion and siltation problems, while decades of drought would have caused catastrophic crop failures and famine. But here the comparison deepens beyond just environmental stress. For the Khmer, the failure was also profoundly socio-political. The immense labor required to maintain their hydraulic network depended on a highly centralized, powerful god-king and a compliant population. When the climate shifts led to repeated system failures, the authority of the rulers likely crumbled. If the king could no longer guarantee the water for the rice, his divine mandate evaporated. This likely led to internal rebellions, a loss of control over outlying provinces, and a gradual abandonment of the over-engineered urban core. People didn't vanish, they simply migrated to more flexible, smaller-scale settlements along the Mekong River, leaving the grand stone capital to be reclaimed by the jungle. Their collapse was silent not because everyone died, but because the political and economic idea of anchor ceased to function. The parallel between these two distant cultures is not that they both fell, but how they fell. Both cases show a tragic inflexibility in the face of change. The Rapa Nui culture was seemingly locked into a pattern of statue construction that was ecologically unsustainable. The Khmer were locked into a massively centralized water system that became a liability when the climate pattern it was designed for suddenly changed. Both societies, in their own way, may have become victims of their own success, doubling down on strategies that brought them power and prestige long after those strategies had begun to undermine their foundation. This comparative lens allows us to move beyond simplistic, single-cause explanations and see collapse as a systems failure, a deadly interplay between environmental pressure and societal rigidity. It suggests that the true risk for any culture lies not in the challenge itself, but in an inability to adapt to it, a lesson that resonates with an unsettling clarity in our own interconnected world. These vanished civilizations are not just relics of a distant past, they are stark and sobering parables for our own modern world, offering a mirror in which we can see our own vulnerabilities reflected with startling clarity. The silent collapse of a culture is the ultimate systems failure, and by studying these ancient breakdowns, we can identify the critical pressure points that threaten our own global society. The first and perhaps most urgent lesson is the non-negotiable necessity of environmental stewardship. We now have the scientific tools that the ancestral Pueblones or the Rapa Nui lacked: satellites that track deforestation in real time, climate models that predict drought patterns, and a deep understanding of ecological carrying capacity. The warning is written in the sediment cores and tree rings of history. A society that exhausts its fundamental resources, be it water, soil, or forests, is essentially sawing off the branch it sits on. Our challenge is to move beyond short-term economic gains and implement long-term, sustainable practices that respect the natural limits of our planet, recognizing that a healthy environment is not a separate issue but the very foundation upon which all complex civilization is built. Equally critical is the lesson of adaptive governance. History consistently shows that rigid, centralized systems are incredibly vulnerable to shock. The Khmer Empire's magnificent water network became its Achilles heel when the climate changed, much like a society today that is overly reliant on a single energy source or a brittle supply chain. Resilience is found in flexibility and decentralization. This means building systems that can absorb disruption, redundant food networks, distributed energy grids, and governance structures that empower local communities to respond nimbly to local crises. It also requires leaders who are accountable, transparent, and willing to make difficult decisions based on evidence rather than ideology or short-term political cycles. A government that loses the trust of its people, as we saw in so many collapsed societies, loses its ability to mobilize collective action when it is needed most. The silent collapse often begins not with a foreign invasion, but with a quiet, internal withdrawal of consent and cooperation. Finally, these stories underscore the profound importance of preserving cultural memory and fostering social cohesion. A society is more than just its economy and infrastructure. It is a shared identity, a common set of values, and a network of mutual trust. The silent collapses teach us that when these intangible bonds fray, when inequality becomes too extreme, when political discourse becomes toxic, when communities fracture into isolated individuals, the entire structure becomes brittle. Investing in cultural institutions, education, and the arts is not a frivolous luxury. It is the essential work of maintaining the social fabric that allows us to weather storms together. Furthermore, we must actively work to preserve knowledge, not just in digital clouds that could be vulnerable to their own form of collapse, but in diverse and durable forms, ensuring that our collective wisdom is not held in a single, fragile vessel. The lessons from the past are clear. Our greatest security lies not in walls or weapons, but in wisdom, adaptability, and a shared commitment to the common good, ensuring that our own story does not one day become another silent mystery for future historians to ponder. There's something uniquely compelling about a puzzle that refuses to be solved, a question that hangs in the air for centuries without a clear answer. This is the powerful allure of historical mysteries like the silent collapses we've explored. They tap into a deep part of our psyche that craves discovery and shudders at the unknown. These aren't just academic exercises, they are profound human stories that challenge the very notion that we can ever fully understand the past. They force us to sit with uncertainty, to acknowledge the vast gaps in our knowledge, and in doing so, they ignite a relentless drive for inquiry that pushes the boundaries of science, history, and archaeology forward. Every unanswered question is an invitation to look closer, to develop a new technology, to re-examine an old artifact with fresh eyes, transforming these enigmas into engines of innovation and discovery. Beyond the thrill of the chase, these vanished cultures hold up a mirror to our own world, serving as powerful metaphors for the fragility and transience of all human achievement. The empty cities and silent fields are a humbling reminder that no civilization, no matter how grand or seemingly permanent, is immune to the currents of change. They are the ultimate memento mori for entire societies, whispering that longevity is never guaranteed and that adaptation is the true key to survival. This realization isn't meant to frighten us, but to inspire a deeper sense of curiosity and perhaps a measure of humility. It encourages us to look at our own bustling cities and complex global networks and ask which of our own practices might be leading us toward resilience and which might be planting the seeds of our own vulnerability. This enduring fascination ensures that the field is never static. It's a living, breathing discipline where a single discovery in a lab, a new way to analyze ancient DNA from a tooth, a satellite image revealing a buried geoglyph can suddenly overturn decades of established theory. The mystery of the silent collapse is what draws brilliant minds to spend their careers sifting through soil samples and studying pollen grains, because they know they are not just studying dust and bones, but are piecing together the most intimate stories of human triumph and tragedy. It is this blend of deep scientific rigor and profound human storytelling that keeps the field forever vibrant, ensuring that the silent echoes of these lost worlds will continue to captivate and challenge us for generations to come. And so our journey into the silent collapses of history draws to a close, but the echoes of these vanished worlds continue to resonate with a profound and haunting clarity. We've traversed the dusty canyons of the American Southwest with the ancestral Pueblones, walked the silent, undeciphered streets of the Indus Valley, and stood in the shadow of the Minoan palaces, all in an effort to understand how entire cultures can simply fade from memory. What we've uncovered is a complex tapestry of causes, a devastating convergence of environmental shifts, internal societal pressures, and the powerful, often silent, forces of external influence and assimilation. These are not stories of a single catastrophic failure, but of a slow unraveling, a series of small, pragmatic choices made under immense pressure that, over generations, led to the complete dissolution of a unique cultural identity. The true lesson of these silent collapses is not one of despair but of perspective. They teach us a deep humility, reminding us that our own modern civilizations, for all their technological might and global interconnectedness, are not immune to the same vulnerabilities. The challenges of climate change, resource management, and social cohesion that we face today are echoes of the very pressures that undid societies of the past. These vanished cultures stand as powerful testament to the fact that resilience is not about building monuments that last forever, but about fostering adaptability, nurturing sustainable relationships with our environment, and maintaining the strong, flexible social bonds that allow a community to weather inevitable storms. Their silence is a cautionary tale, urging us to look beyond short-term gains and consider the long-term legacy of our choices. Ultimately, history is far more than the story written by the victors in stone and parchment. It is also the story written in the quiet absences, the empty spaces where a people once thrived. By learning to listen to this silence, we honor the memory of those who were lost and enrich our understanding of the human experience in all its complexity and fragility. I'd love to hear which of these historical mysteries you find most compelling. Was it the stubborn pride of the Greenland Norse, the puzzling abandonment of the Indus Valley cities, or the haunting mystery of Roanoke? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into the past, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration. Thank you for joining me on this journey to decode the silent collapse. Until next time, keep wondering.